topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Hello and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity. And we have a very good one tonight. Our guest will be Antonio de Loera, and he is the director, he's communications director for the United Farm Workers. And he's going to share information about defending immigrant workers and neighbors. And the title of this is called Challenges Facing Immigrant Workers and Neighbors. He also serves on the board of the Mexican-American Concilio of Yolo County and as executive director of the Yolo County Democratic Party. He's a local Davis resident and graduated from Davis High School in 2013. And he may also be recognized from his run for Yolo County Supervisor in 2024. Antonio, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I know in the past you were a guest host for the show a couple of years ago.
That's right. Yeah, that was in 2023, I want to say. So that was 6 years ago now, or 3 years ago now.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you have a very full schedule, and so many people are so concerned, upset, paying attention, worried about the challenges that immigrant workers are facing in America, and you're an excellent resource to give us some perspective. But before we start, I just want folks to hear a little bit about how long you've been doing this work and paying attention to these issues, and where has your experience extended to?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to find a concrete start date for this. So I'll just, speaking personally, my parents are Mexican immigrants, so I always felt kind of like I was growing up in a milieu of, aware, if nothing else, of the existence of a border, little things like, my grandma, I would see my grandma's Mexican passport and, would see that she had a visa stamp on it. And, I remember once when I was little getting upset just at the idea that, my grandma had to ask someone for permission to come see me, and what would happen if ever they told her no, and that's still us being at the the very, I would say, lucky end of the Mexican immigrant experience spectrum. Growing up in Yolo County, I think that I'm definitely aware of the fact that there's a lot of poverty here, and that poverty does seem to be disproportionately concentrated in the Mexican community. Certainly, when I was growing up, I had a lot of friends who were the children of migrant farm workers, and I would go over to the Davis migrant camp to, play with them or whatever it was. And, you just see as a kid the fact that some houses are much smaller than other houses that you would see, for example, in Mace Ranch, where I grew up. And so I think I always had that awareness, and then slowly, you start turning that awareness into wanting to do things. So the first thing I really did is I ran the after school program at the Madison Migrant Center out on Highway 16 between Esparto and Woodland. This is another migrant farm worker camp where I ran the after school program that was put on by the Yolo Interfaith Immigration Network. I did that every summer from 2013 through 2017. I consider it really my first job. And I was lucky there to really build some lasting relationships with those families. And as you do that, you just start to become even more aware of some of the issues. For example, accessing the social safety net, the way that county services are often not accessible or even comprehensible to some of these communities, and you start just trying to help people navigate those structures as best you can, taking advantage of the fact that I speak Spanish, I speak English. By this point, I was receiving a college education, so I kind of felt more empowered and able to just try to troubleshoot situations for families. And I think that's really where my interest in this began. At the same time, when I was in college in LA, I was doing a lot of not just campus activism, but also work at the border. In particular, I was volunteering at a deportee shelter in Tijuana. Basically, one weekend every month, I would go down there. And this was a shelter for men who had just been deported. So, when people are kind of unceremoniously dumped at the fence, right? I mean, often people have been living in the United States for, 10, 20, 30 years. They have all of their family in the United States. They have their house, their belongings, their savings in the United States. And, they're returned to Mexico, which is a country that in many cases they haven't been to for a very long time. They're dumped right there at the border. Whereas in most cases, these folks, if they do have relatives and roots in Mexico, are from much further south, right? If you're a Oaxacan man who's been living in Los Angeles for 20, 30 years, and you find yourself basically dumped overnight homeless in Tijuana, right? The shelter was designed to be the first stop for those people so they could at least have a safe place to spend the night, get some meals, and start to try to get their feet out from under them. We would often be the first time that they could make a phone call home to the United States to tell their family in the United States that, they were okay and that they were in Tijuana, whatever was going, or they would try to call, a village somewhere in southern Mexico or Mexico City or wherever it was and try to figure out just transportation, how to get there. So really sad situations that, we were just trying to offer kind of a small mercy to. I went to a Jesuit college, and this was a church run shelter, actually run by an American priest, Father Pat. And yeah, I think you just start to, break bread with those guys, because we would always, not just feed the meals, but also take the meals with them and talk and hear their stories, what people had been doing in the US. And yeah, I think that really was what opened my eyes to the injustice of our immigration system, the cruelty of our immigration laws. And that's really what sparked my interest in, I guess, ultimately politics, because I realized that if you want to actually shape these policies, these are political questions. When I graduated college, I went to work in Washington, D.C., first for a member of Congress, Joaquin Castro. I was a staffer for him when he was chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. So I was doing a lot of immigration policy work and a lot of congressional oversight work during the first Trump administration. Then when Biden won, I did serve in the Biden administration. I was at the U.S. Department of State, but I always maintained that connection to Yolo County, the interest in those farm worker families. I stayed in very close touch with a number of those families. And so eventually, even I'd ended up doing quite a bit of foreign policy work on Ukraine and Afghanistan, but really home was always where my heart was, and being interested in immigration issues, economic issues, labor issues. And so that's why when the United Farm Workers was looking for a communications director, I saw that as my ticket home. And I've been with the UFW now for 3 years. So actually going on 4 years. So very grateful to be doing this work, very grateful to be able to be home where I grew up, and trying to just do what I can in both my professional and personal capacities to make Yolo County a good place for working people to live.
That is a very thick background of, like, you really, really know the issues and the lives of people. Just really appreciate your relationships that make what you do count and matter, and just so responsive.
I try.
And I know there's just so much cruelty right now that is more visible to more people. but before we get to, you were talking about like more about the current challenges in this extremely heightened, ICE, Border Patrol orders to take on roles that they're not trained for and commit more unspeakable acts than apparently were happening before. You did say that for a long time we've had problems with their immigration policies and laws, and I don't know if you want to comment on that and as a way to just sort of give us a little bit more background.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've been attending, the vigils and the rallies here locally, in honor of the 2 U.S. citizens who were killed in Minneapolis. I do think there's definitely a fair perception that, I mean, it's true that ICE's budget has been massively expanded, and that's one of the things that is being argued about right now in the Senate is, can we at least try to get the funding back down to a reasonable level, if not eliminate it completely. But I think it's true that there's a lot of new folks and there's a lot of tactics that certainly are very alien to a lot of Americans. But I think having that experience at the border, I'll actually say that one way to think about what's happening now is that the border has kind of been brought to everywhere. And if I'll just give you an example. In 2014, I spent quite a bit of time in Nogales, Arizona. And Nogales is a really interesting city because it was actually founded before the United States declared independence, when that territory was Spain. And then just based on how the 1853 Gadsden Purchase ended up, the town is divided in the middle. So there is, the city of Nogales that goes back to the 1770s, and then the border wall runs through it. And there's a Nogales, Arizona, and there's a Nogales, Sonora. And so it actually is a little reminiscent of maybe East and West Berlin, of you have this one community that predates the wall that separates it. But I bring that up because in 2012, a Border Patrol agent who was never named, never identified, shot and killed I believe 16 or maybe 17-year-old Mexican citizen who was on the Mexican side of the wall. And the official story, though there was never any footage of this, so there was never any way to prove this, but the official story that the Border Patrol gave, which the young man's family denied, is that he was intending to cross illegally. He had a backpack. Maybe he'd thrown a rock. Maybe there was a theory that he was a drug mule. None of that was ever substantiated. But what did happen is effectively an American border agent shot from the wall, through the wall, and killed a Mexican minor in Mexico, on Mexican soil, basically for getting too close to the wall, even though he was never on U.S. soil. And that was a story that really stuck with me, that to me really spoke to the impunity of the culture at the border, right? Where these border agents really do feel empowered to use violent force against unarmed people. And that shooting happened in 2012. So Barack Obama was president. And I say that because the man who shot Rene Good was an 8-year veteran of Border Patrol before he became an ICE agent and killed a U.S. citizen, Nicole Good, in Minneapolis this month. And then the agents who shot and killed Alex Preddy were current Border Patrol agents. And though their identities have still not been made known, it was said by one of the government officials that they were also relatively experienced Border Patrol agents. So look, for all I know, it's the same guys. For all I know, it's the same guy who shot this kid in Mexico, killed these U.S. citizens in Minneapolis. People have been outraged. How on earth can we not know the identities of these Border Patrol agents who shot and killed this U.S. citizen? Well, it's been over 10 years, and we still don't know the identity of the Border Patrol agent who killed that Mexican child in 2012. So I do think, we're rightly horrified by this. But one of the things I struggle with sometimes is you do hear people say, well, Border Patrol needs to go back to the border. They need to get out of our cities and go back to the border. But, I do take some issue with that, because I just say, well, the border doesn't deserve this either, right? People in Minneapolis don't deserve to live this way, but neither do people in Nogales or Calexico or El Paso or Brownsville or all these communities that exist on the border and should not be militarized, should not be having to deal with checkpoints and racial profiling and all these things that really have been the day-to-day reality of people who live along the border for a very long time now, predating even the first Trump administration. And so that's one point that I think is important to make is, we really need to look at the way our immigration enforcement system has been working. It's been out of sight and out of mind for a long time, but that doesn't mean that it was pretty.
I really appreciate that. That's why I wanted to ask you that question, because you're right. I am, and like you am, in no way trying to minimize the horror that we're seeing now with the abuse of power by the Border Patrol or ICE agents out in American cities, really terrifying people, and I think stirring up anger in situations that would not otherwise be happening. But I knew you had seen more, and this wasn't just the origin of it. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind for so many people who are not paying attention and haven't been paying attention for decades.
And it was, and it is different, right? When it's happening on your street, right? And I think what I think this moment calls for is for people to realize, we don't want this to happen to us. And then the next step is we don't want this to happen to anyone, right? And it's that golden rule thing. If I don't want something to happen to me, I need to be able to say that I don't want it to happen to anyone. And, no one deserves this. And I think we can have a moment here where even as we mourn and are angry about what's been happening just recently, we can use that as a window to actually understand, maybe even empathize a little bit more, right? I mean, one of the things that is really horrifying about the current moment is ICE really is beginning to treat U.S. citizens the way it's been treating immigrants for a very long time. And, I would just challenge us all to say, well, of course, our rights as citizens are sacred and must not be infringed upon. But that goes for everyone's human rights, and immigrants, including undocumented immigrants who live in this country, even if they didn't come in the right way, for the most part, are hardworking, good people who contribute enormously. Certainly here in Yolo County, we would not have an agricultural industry or a downtown restaurant industry or a hospitality industry or a construction industry. You name it, we probably wouldn't have it if it wasn't for a lot of immigrant workers, including many who unfortunately lack legal documentation. But two things. One, everyone on U.S. soil is entitled to the protections of the Constitution. It does not matter if they're foreign born. It does not matter what their status is. If you are in the United States, if you're on U.S. soil, these rights apply to you. And then subsequently, there is human rights, right? There's a universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the UN that the U.S. respects, that the U.S. says it should abide by. And, there are these fundamental, I would argue, very ancient values. I'm a Catholic, so I'll say, we're all made in the equal image of God. Whatever you believe is what you believe, but every human being has dignity. And that is certainly true for the people who do so much of the hard labor in this country, without whom we really wouldn't be able to have food on our tables.
That is another great point that I think, what the heck? How ridiculous it is to not think of that aspect. I mean, the inhumanity is the grossest, most depressing, horrific part of talking about how immigrants are mistreated. And you're right, not only is it U.S. Constitution, everybody on the soil has due process and is protected by the Constitution and the human rights. But I think of the small percentage of people who are behind this removal and force and abuse that's currently escalating. What are they thinking about the economy? Honestly, how can you be so ignorant? I mean, I'm using a nice word. I'm just saying ignorant. How can you be so ignorant by
Well,
how
I'll
much
say,
we have depended on it and exploited immigrants forever for the incredible benefits and contributions that they give to our economy.
yeah, and so I think it's interesting. I mean, these are complicated issues, right? I mean, I work for a labor union, so you're not going to find me ever say that, unlimited open borders, whoever wants to
Right.
come here, whenever wants to come here. Like, obviously, that creates challenges for wages and for labor markets, and I want working people in this country, very much including U.S. citizens, to be able to get ahead and get good jobs. And I understand the reality and the frustration that some people feel. And frankly, a lot of people walk up to me now and they ask me, what about Latinos for Trump? Why did why? And sometimes I can get offended by this, or not offended, but sometimes liberals can be quite condescending about these issues when they say, oh, well, don't the Latinos know that, Trump hates them and aren't they going to get deported now? And almost serves them right. And, I don't find that a particularly empathetic or useful way of approaching politics. Certainly it's not a good way to convince people. But I understand, being in this community, if you are the kind, I'll give you the example of, maybe a lawnmower situation, right? If you are an affluent person and you own a big house and you have a big yard and a big lawn, right? And there's a Mexican guy who will, mow your lawn for $30. And all of a sudden, more people come across the border from Venezuela, which has been lately the increase. And they'll, someone says, oh, look, I'll mow your lawn for $20, right? If you're the homeowner, you think, great, I get to save $10 a day on mowing the lawn. If you're the Venezuelan, right, you probably just crossed thousands of miles, right? You're desperate for a job. You've probably got a family back home you're trying to send money home to, right? Completely understand people wanting to come here and grind and work and take what they can get to get ahead. And then the last side, right? If you're the Mexican guy and you've been mowing this guy's lawn every day for 10 years, and one day he says, hey, you know what? Sorry, I found a guy who'll do it for cheaper. You're also feeling like, well, what the heck? How am I going to feed my kids? How am I going to pay my rent? And so there is competition, economic competition. But what I always come back to is, for as long as a group of workers is afraid and is more afraid of getting deported than anything else, that's going to be a group of workers that's very easy to exploit. That's going to be a group of workers that's not going to feel comfortable speaking out if their wages are stolen or if their workplace conditions are not safe. And ultimately, that's bad for every group of workers, right? That does push down wages, that does push down working conditions and standards. And in the end, if you want to protect those workers, though, what we need to do is we need to make them citizens. And what I believe working people really need is a pathway to citizenship for undocumented workers that allows them all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, including, right, the ability to call the labor department if your wages are being stolen, or if you're being asked to work for below minimum wage, gives you the right to join a union freely and fully. And then for U.S. citizen workers, that's also an advantage because there's no longer any sort of unfair competition. So I do think we can have a secure border. We can control who's coming in and we can limit that number to what we feel works for our society and for our economy. But we need to make sure that we do not have this permanent underclass of basically second-class citizens who live here by the millions, who, are our neighbors, their kids go to school with us. We cannot have millions of people excluded from our democracy living alongside us. That's just not conducive to a fair and free society. And, the Trump people sometimes will almost agree with me and they'll say, great. And the solution is we need to get rid of them all. And that's where I say, well, no, first of all, you cannot possibly get rid of them all. Second of all, by trying, you're going to break the country. I mean, the only way to get rid of, 12 million people in this country who are here undocumented at least is by creating a police state, basically, right? And I always used to say that as, you're going to have to create a police state to do this. You can't do this. And of course, that's what they're doing now, right? Is they're saying, okay, well,
Right.
we will create a police state. But even with the horrendousness of everything we've experienced, the actual number of deportations is, I mean, it's. I don't want to. I hate to sound callous, because each one of those stories is an individual, and behind each one of those stories, there's very often a broken family, kids who've had their dad taken away, families dealing with having lost their main breadwinners, struggling to make rent. I don't want to make light of the stories, but in numeric terms, it's a very small percentage of undocumented people who have actually been deported. And if I had to bet, the vast majority of undocumented people who were here in 2024 are still going to be here in 2028 and 2029. They're going to be a lot more scared. They're going to be a lot more exploitable, but they're still going to be here. And you know what? I have to say it, for the Republicans, for Trump, for these billionaires, this frankly suits them. This is the sweet spot for them. They have this large, desperate workforce that if they ever complain, hey, I send that one home. He's complaining about wages again. But at the same time, they have this big pool of people who are not just available, they're desperate, and they're so afraid they're not going to ever speak out. So for big business, they've kind of got this sweet spot right now where they have a workforce that doesn't have rights. And rather than argue about, rather than fight amongst ourselves, I wish that people could come together and agree that everyone in this country deserves the rights to be an American, deserves the protections of being an American. And that way, when we do compete, we can compete on a fair and level playing field.
That is a great vision to paint for us. Way too underseen and understated and understood. And I just think of just the absurdity of creating a police state. And I just saw before we started this show that 5-year-old in the Dilley ICE facility languishing in his father's lap.
Yeah. I have a connection there, actually. I believe the gentleman who's the reason that picture exists is my former boss, Joaquin Castro,
That's right.
who went to the facility. And I mean, look, I think this is the level of what we need to expect from our Democratic members of Congress, and I can be tough. I mean, I'm the executive director of the Yolo County Democrats, but I expect a lot of our Democratic electeds. I work hard to help them get elected, but I want them to do a lot when they get elected. And, sometimes people say, oh, you're too tough on some of these members of Congress, but I have to say, I work for one who I know can do this stuff. So I've seen it. And Joaquin Castro, I mean, the boy's name is Liam. He's 5 years old. His family's from Ecuador, came in legally, by the way, asking for asylum. And, they took him and his dad and they moved them to Texas. And so this is not Joaquin Castro's constituent, right? They're not from his district, nor is the detention facility in his district either, right? But he saw this kid and he saw that they were in this detention center in Texas. And he said, I'm going to go there. I'm going to go check on him. And that's the level of concern and attention that I think, I want to see that from every member of Congress, certainly every Democrat. And, that's the level of concern and attention that our kids deserve, all of our kids. And I think, especially when we're talking about kids, right, every adult needs to be responsible for every kid. And, like in the first Trump administration, putting kids in detention centers, right, basically jails, when they've literally done nothing wrong is beyond cruel and really has, that is not something that any society can be proud of. And certainly as an American, I feel deep shame about the fact that that's what our government is doing with our tax dollars.
You are not alone. So many of us feel like we have blood on our hands because our dollars are paying for so much of this beyond our control to an extent. But tell us more about what we can do to use our power. And I totally agree. We need to pressure our representatives in Congress to keep acting.
Yeah, and to be creative, right? I mean, so much of our political landscape now, right, is about, frankly, it's about seizing narratives and drawing attention to problems. And what people have, I mean, it's the bully pulpit effect, right? When you don't, especially, and I appreciate we don't have the majority in Congress. We need to go flip the House. Like, I am among the many working on that, right? But in the meantime, I think we can hold our representatives to a very high standard, and we can push them, and people can always be better. As far as what we can do now, I mean, I think one of the great lessons of what's happening in Minneapolis is, you can't always wait for your elected leaders to be the ones to lead, right? And really, what's so interesting and inspiring about what's happening in Minneapolis is it's been really just regular people, neighbors, friends, family, concerned citizens, unions, teachers who've really taken the lead here and refuse to let this happen in their name quietly. And I think I sometimes put it as, you can make this happen on our dime, but you can't make this happen, at least not in my name, right? And certainly speaking out, going to protest, that all matters. But I think the direct action component of what people are doing, not just in Minneapolis, but also here, right? The Migra Watch program that NorCal Resist runs, I think is incredible. Would certainly encourage people who have not done that training to look into the NorCal Resist Migra Watch program. That's basically the ICE watch, and they train people to be legal observers. And, there's a lot of rumors out there. There's a lot of reported sightings that often turn out to be false. And we just want to make sure that all of our neighbors, as well as us, have the best information possible. And so that entails, hey, we heard ICE is out on this road. Can someone go check, right? That's the more people are involved, the more eyeballs we have, the more effective these sorts of community watch programs are. So certainly that's one thing people can do. And, there's a lot of other good efforts. I want to shout out the organization that I worked for when I ran the after school camp over 10 years ago, which is the Yolo Interfaith Immigration Network. They are a great resource for immigrant families. And again, I think we really need to understand the economic pieces of this, right? We talked a lot about how, really a lot of what's happening here is that big business wants to exploit immigrant workers, and they benefit from the fact that these workers are here, but they also benefit from the fact that those workers are excluded from citizenship. So speaking about, the UFW, we see this all the time. Farmers don't want raids on their farms. They don't want ICE coming by and looking at the papers of their workers, especially not right before harvest, because they know that is bad for them if they can't, for example, get their carrots out of the ground. But those same growers, they're, a lot of the ag industry is very Republican. These growers are not asking their Congress people, hey, get my workers citizenship. If anything, they're asking for more visas so they can bring in more workers. But those visa programs are also they're not immigrant visas. It's a kind of indentured servitude, really, where employers control the visas, and the workers who come in on the visas can't even switch jobs if they don't like it. They're trapped with one specific employer. So, the growers will do that, but they never go to Congress and say, hey, I have 10 workers who are all undocumented. I need them. Please make them citizens. And that's the kind of thing that, that's the hypocrisy here. But I digress to say, which is, there's been a lot of talk about workers being afraid to go to work. And it's true that workers are afraid to go to work. That said, workers are still going to work despite being afraid. And, it's not really, this is just common sense if you think about it, right? Farm workers are generally poor. Immigrant workers in other industries like hospitality and restaurants, I mean, these are minimum wage jobs. These are not folks who have years worth of savings where they can just stay home for days, let alone weeks, let alone 4 years on end. I mean, I've seen this in Kern County in January of last year. We had Border Patrol raids in Kern County. And even while the raids were ongoing, I was talking to farm workers who would still go out to work. And I would say, don't go to work. Like, Border Patrol is in the county. Do not go to work. Stay home. Stay home. And they would say, I need to make the rent. I need to go to work. And so, here in Davis in February of last year, we had a gentleman who worked at one of the restaurants, a popular restaurant downtown. He was a kitchen, very popular with his colleagues. And he is the father of a student, U.S. born, U.S. kid born here, who goes to one of the DGUSD elementary schools. And then his wife, the kid's mom, who is herself also works in a downtown restaurant, in a different one, in a different kitchen. And he was very sadly picked up by ICE in February of 2025. And he's been in detention ever since. And, me and others, we worked very hard to get this guy a lawyer. And we think we've got him a good lawyer. And we're hopeful that eventually, through due process, he will be able to come back out and be with his family. But in the meantime, this family lost basically 50% of their income, right? In addition to the huge emotional blow of losing a husband and a father, it is an economic blow when you had a 2-parent household all of a sudden go to a 1-income, 1-parent household. And these are low-wage jobs. These are not high-paying jobs that people have working in the restaurants downtown. And so this family came close to eviction twice because they could not make the rent. And both times it was the Yolo Interfaith Immigration Network that helped write them a check so they could stay housed at the very least as they go through all this, right? And so that's where I say, there's a lot we can do to look out for our neighbors, right? Make sure ICE is not coming to town. We can certainly lobby our federal representatives for better laws. And then also, I think we need to think about the long-term consequences here and how we support people who have had people deported, because it has happened, and unfortunately, it's likely to continue. There's probably at least a couple more arrests, a couple more deportations that will happen in Davis and Yolo County before this time of our U.S. history is over. And we need to be ready to support those families, not just on the day after, but in the year after. And then just broadly, I think we need to really look at the economic conditions that people are living in. Davis has been a sanctuary city since 1986. We were, sanctuary resolution since 1986. But you can't be a sanctuary if no one can afford to live here. And when you have, 8 people sharing a 1-bathroom apartment because they can't afford rent otherwise, when you've got people working, immigrant workers working 2 jobs. I know a woman who works the whole morning, 7 a.m. to around 3 in a farm in the fields, and then she turns right around and works basically the night shift from like 5 to 10 to closing at a restaurant in Davis, right? So she's 2 jobs just to pay the rent, just to stay afloat. And obviously I want to protect that person from being taken by ICE, and we're doing that. But also I want her to not have to work 2 jobs. I want her to be able to have a roof over her head, to have food on the table, to have a doctor when she needs one, and not feel stressed out and like she's just battling to make ends meet every month. And so that's where I think if we really want to support our immigrant neighbors, ICE and talking about immigration issues, that's one part of it. But we also need to talk about the economic issues and how do we make the American dream real for these people who have sacrificed so much for it.
Thanks for outlining those things, and especially at a time when so many other people on this land also are starting to think that they can't make the American dream real themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, and let's face it, that's where sometimes xenophobia comes from, right? When people are feeling like they can't get ahead, it's very tempting to go to blame your neighbor who doesn't look like you, or who doesn't talk the same language as you do, or speaks it with an accent. So absolutely, there are broader questions here that don't just impact our immigrant community. And I'm a proponent of the labor movement across the board, and certainly believe in building a stronger social safety net for everyone, particularly U.S. citizens, very much including particularly U.S. citizens. But I just think that we will fail to do that. We will fail to build a country that works for working people as long as we let ourselves be divided by race or by religion or by what side of the border we were born on, because that's that's what we're seeing right now, is that working people are being divided. Things are getting worse for everyone. And one group of this country is being told, hey, once we deport, millions of people, everything's going to be great. And, just let us be in charge, and we're going to get rid of all the Mexicans. And some people unfortunately believe that. And I think we need to give them something else to believe in. And that's the job ultimately, I think, for left-wing politics, is we need to convince people that solidarity is the way forward, that we can all have a better life together.
I totally agree with that. I was the other day having a conversation with someone who we've recognized for a few years that we have very different belief systems, and we vote for opposite parties, and yet we don't want to be so controlled by the current smashing in of ideology that we refuse to give up on each other. And just sometimes it's a simple thing like, if I send you a clip from the sources of news I think are credible, will you watch them? It just so sometimes it takes just little basic steps like that, and then oh yeah, and gosh, would you watch ones that I send you? I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's also such a privileged space to be in. I kind of had another thought after that. I was like, wow, here some of us are at in a house safe from direct violence at the moment, and all we're saying is all we have to do is turn the channel. I mean, literally to understand each other more and see the propaganda or the different points of views being pummeled, and the whole echo chamber thing, step out of our echo chambers. That's sometimes all you have to do to understand other human beings and build the solidarity that you're talking about.
And it's interesting, right? I mean, certainly in the Mexican American community, there was a lot of support for Trump in the last election. You're seeing that change now, right? Because people are reacting to reality. It's interesting. I was in Bakersfield before the 2024 election, and I was knocking on doors for a Democratic House candidate down there. And I was talking to this guy, and it was a Latino guy, and we were talking in English, both born here, and he told me he was going to vote for Trump. And I kind of regret how I handled that one, because I got a little annoyed with him, and I was like, come on, because earlier in the conversation he had told me that his mom was undocumented, and I told him, I'm like, this guy's going to try to deport your mom, man. Don't vote for this guy, and he told me, he was like, come on, dude, fuck off. Sorry, I don't know if I could say that on TV, but he was just like, don't try to scare me, don't try to scare me with this stuff. If you want to talk about issues, we can talk about issues, but don't try to scare me with Trump's going to deport my mom. That's a low blow, is what he told me. And I was kind of like, but he said he's going to. He said he's going to. They had mass deportation signs at the convention. This isn't a secret. I'm telling you what he's running on. And he said, dude, he was president once already, and my mom was fine. So what do you mean? People say things, but that's not what's going to happen. And I thought about that for a long time, because in a way, he made a very reasonable calculation, right? He, for whatever, presumably he was upset with Biden for whatever reason, probably a lot to do with the cost of living and inflation and these issues that defined the 2024 election. And, he's aware of the fact that Trump is saying some stuff about immigration, and he could, he recognizes that he has family members who he loves who are undocumented. And he just thought, well, but Trump was already president, and that did not happen. And, what's the best predictor of what someone's going to do? Well, what they've done before. And a lot of people, I think, felt like, well, look, Trump 1 was pretty bad in a lot of ways, but particularly at the border, right? A lot of the really bad abuses that happened in the first Trump administration were to people who were crossing the border, right? These families that were crossing the border that got separated. But there wasn't that much enforcement in what we call the interior, right? Again, the border
Right.
has come to every city, to every town, right? And so, but look, from 2016 to 2020, if you were already here, if you were an undocumented person who, right? I mean, most undocumented people who are here now, who are living in fear, they were already here when Trump was president the first time.
That's
And
right.
so I think a lot of people felt, not unreasonably, that basically it was going to be fine. And now I think people are really realizing and waking up to, oh no, this is different. This is bad. They're really going after everyone, not just criminals, not just the bad people, because that was the other thing a lot of people said is, yeah, okay, but they're going to go after the criminals. And if I'm here and I pay my taxes and I work hard and I raise my kids and I stay out of trouble, I'll be okay. And I think what people more and more are realizing, not just through the news, but really through experience, right? And that's what it is more and more people, we just start to hear stories. We know people, like, oh my God, they took such and such person, right? That's what I find really changes people's minds. And I've had conversations with people who I know voted for Trump in the Latino community, who have told me, like, wow, like, I did not think this was going to happen. I don't understand. Like, he said he was going to go after bad people, but I know people who are not bad who have been taken.
Yeah.
And I think some of those people still feel like, oh, well, there must be some mistake. And I think, though, but the more of those stories there are, I think people are realizing, oh, this isn't a mistake. This is what he's doing. This is what he wants. And my hope is that, as dark as this moment is, that we can come out of that with this newfound understanding, this newfound concern and solidarity for our neighbors, for each other, citizens, for immigrants amongst ourselves, right? The immigrants I know are pretty good. I bet you the immigrants you know are pretty good. Hey, maybe most of the immigrants everyone knows are pretty good, right? I think once you start building on that, my hope is that in 2028 we can change administrations and then really move towards what we should have had a long time ago, which is not just, obviously we need to hold ICE accountable. We need to dismantle this immigration police state that Trump has built, but we also need to pass a pathway to citizenship. We need to make sure that the people who are living here, who are working hard, who are, members of our community that we rely on, that we need and that we love, those folks we need to make sure can stay here and become American citizens.
And we're interdependent. We depend on them, and we need to be responsible to them as well, and acknowledge how exploited they have been for decades, centuries. I just want to add a couple things to what you said. And I know we're almost out of time, but I'll give you time for your closing thought. When I was on a speaking circuit, I would have statistics memorized, but all I know is that less than half of the people being grabbed. And if you watch like the clips that are being put online right away, there's no time for them to be edited. There's just so much good information from primary sources from witnesses. You see that doesn't seem to be, like, the mask, the lack of IDs, the lack of warrants, and the brutality is so unprofessional and horrible. And of course, it turns out most of the people they're grabbing are not actually criminals, have not violated laws. It's just so extremely irrational. I also believe that there's going to be a breaking point, and like, hats off to Minnesotans in Minnesota, and boy, have they modeled standing up extremely well. And our hearts go out to everyone being attacked and violated and shot to death so wrongly. Not that there's ever a right way, but there's so many things you said I wanted to recap, but instead of me recapping things that you said, which are so important, let me give you like another minute or two to just say any kind of closing thought. Also any contact information if you want to.
Yeah, well, for Yolo County residents, for Davis residents, would certainly encourage folks, again, to get involved with NorCal Resist Migra Watch program. Donate to the Yolo Interfaith Immigration Network. They're providing really good financial support for families that have lost breadwinners. And just remember, right, we're talking about immigration justice. Well, and social justice broadly. We can't have social justice without economic justice. Even now, amidst all these raids, the primary stressor in Yolo County immigrants' lives is their rent is too high and their wages are too low. So long run, we need to address that to be able to give working people a fair shot and a good way to live here in Yolo County. And until then, we need to defend our neighbors all the way and make sure that this is a place that when we say is for everyone, we really mean that. And we're willing to fight for that.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Greatly appreciate the knowledge and experience you've shared. It's very educational and informational.
Thanks for having me.
You are so welcome. And I want to thank our engineer Rebel and our producer Dean and all the listeners and viewers. And please share this information and be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. on Talk4TV or W4CY.com. And may we all have enriching conversations like this in and about diversity and safety and creating unity and solidarity for everyone. Thank you.